Every dream comes with a price. Your dream of graduating from college comes with a price of time, money, and effort. Your dream of getting the perfect job comes with a price of time and effort. Your dream of having a loving family comes with the price of time, effort, and emotion. We all have dreams, some big, some small. Jesse Duran had a dream. He wanted to see a real gun, hold a real gun, shoot a real gun. And that came with the price of Sidney Park's life and shattered the dreams of Andy Lee Park's loving family. We, the plaintiff, have proven that Hayden Duran is liable for the intentional shooting by his son Jesse. We have done this by the preponderance of the evidence, which means we have proven that it is more likely than not that Jesse Duran intentionally shot Sidney Park. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have two jobs today. Your first job is to listen to all the evidence presented to you today, which you've now completed. Your second job, and most important job, is to come up with your own conclusion about today's case and tell your fellow jurors why you think the way you do. And I'm going to give you the tools to do this. Now, we first must look at the law for liable for an intentional shooting. To impose liability on a parent or legal guardian under Midland Civil Code Section 10.38a, a plaintiff must prove the following elements. 1. The defendant had custody and control over a minor child. 2. The child committed an act of willful misconduct. 3. The plaintiff or plaintiff's descendant suffered injury or death. And 4. The willful misconduct by the child was the direct and proximate cause of the harm suffered. Now, let's take a look at these elements and what we have proven today. Under the first element, you have heard many times throughout today's trial that Hayden Duran is the sole parent of Jesse Duran. Now let's look at element 2. The child committed an act of willful misconduct. Now, before we go into today's testimony, we must define an act of willful misconduct. Under Midland Civil Code Section 10.38b1, act of willful misconduct means any criminal offense that requires the knowledge, purpose, or willfulness, or any intentional tort. Well, you've heard from Hayden Duran today that Jesse has not committed any criminal offense according to today's case. We cannot prove element A, but we can prove any intentional tort. Now let's look at the definition of an intentional tort. An intentional tort is defined as under Midland Civil Code Section 2.01a. A person acts with intent to produce a consequence if 1. The person acts with the purpose of producing that consequence, or 2. The person acts knowing that the consequence is substantially likely to result. Now let's take a look at that second element, that they knew that the consequence was likely to result. Now you heard from Dr. Campbell Silva, a licensed psychologist with a focus on children, that Jesse had extreme violent behavior, and he had an interest in guns. And this was backed up by the testimony of Andy Park, who had also testified to Jesse's extreme violent behavior when he had a video game taken away and he threw a fit like Andy had never seen before. Andy Park also testified that Jesse really liked violent video games in which he was shooting another person in the game. Now, we have also seen this through the exhibits of 1, 2, and 3. Now, the first exhibit was an email from an email from Hayden Duran to her friend Casey French. Hayden stated in this email that Jesse was saying to other kids, "Bang, you're dead." Now let's take a look at Exhibit 2, in which it states that Jesse was suspended from school for 5 days because he violently kicked and punched other children. And this, in fact, was his third incident of the school year. Now, lastly, let's look at Exhibit 3. Now, Exhibit 3 was meant to be a school assignment for Jesse, in which he needed to draw a picture of him with his best friend. The title of this drawing in Exhibit 3 is Me and My Gun by Jesse Duran. Now, each panel in this drawing shows Jesse Duran doing multiple things with his gun. And in fact, in one panel, it shows him scaring bad kids away by him pointing his gun at other children. And in the last panel, it says, I heart my gun. As you can see, we have clearly proven that Jesse Duran knew what the consequence was, which he would have seen through the multiple video games and his many violent acts, and he wanted to produce that consequence. Thus, we have proved element 2. Now, if we look at element 3, like I said before, Jesse Duran's dream was to shoot a gun, and that came with the price of Sidney Park's life. Now let's look at element 4. The willful misconduct by the child was the direct approximate cause of the harm suffered. Direct cause. But for Jesse Duran's action of shooting the gun, Sidney would still be here today. Proximate cause. Now, to prove proximate cause, you have to prove that this result was foreseeable. Now, we've heard from Hayden Duran that he let Sidney and Jesse stay home alone with a gun. He knew there was a gun in the home, and yet he still let the children stay there. And like we've said before, Jesse has had past violent actions and was particularly interested in guns. Thus, this result was foreseeable. Proximate cause. Now, the defense today is going to try to bring up an affirmative defense called comparative fault. To do this, they have their own burden of proof. They must prove each of these elements by preponderance of the evidence according to Sidney Park instead of Jesse Duran. However, they cannot do this. They cannot prove that Sidney Park committed an act of willful misconduct, which, like we said before, was an intentional tort. Sidney did not know that this consequence was likely to result, and did not want to produce this consequence. And we know this because Jesse Duran was the one who shot the gun. Jesse Duran was the one who had his fingerprints all over the gun, according to Jules Sebastian, and he was the one who had the GSR all over his arm and his chest, according to Jules Sebastian, the lead forensic investigator. And lastly, you cannot prove that Sidney Park's actions were a direct and proximate cause to the harm suffered. Every dream comes with a price. Jesse Duran wanted to shoot a real gun. That came with the price of Sidney Park's life. We, the plaintiff, ask you to find Hayden Duran liable for the intentional shooting by his son Jesse.